Ben looked at this man he had lived with for most of his life. I don't think you believe me. His uncle lowered his eyes. I don't think you deliberately kill anybody for no reason. But if a man knocked you down with a locator, well, you've got an awful hot temper. Ben lowered his head. Okay, Unc, he said. I'll see you later, Ben. Yeah, Ben said. Around 1 o'clock, the deputy and the Boy Scout turned up again. As the boy came in with the food, Ben said, Don, do me a favor, will you? Go down to the diagnostics center and ask that kid down there, I think his name is Sochek, to look in. Now wait a minute, fella, the deputy said at the door. Nothing like that, fella. Ben turned on him. Whose side are you on? I'm not on anybody's side, so you just cool it. Okay, Ben said. So you go ask that guy who cleans up down there to look in the trash and see if there's a slingshot in it. A slingshot, the deputy said, disgusted. You're asking somebody to root around in the trash for a slingshot. Ben walked to the door. The deputy must have thought he was trying to escape. He stepped over to block the door and put his hand on his gun. Ben stopped in front of him and said, A man claims I shot him with a rifle. I didn't. I shot him with a slingshot. If I can find it, I can prove it. So I'll appreciate it if you will help me find it. If I get time, the deputy said, letting Don out and closing the door. The long day dragged on, and it was well after dark before Deputy and Don Smith came in with the evening meal. Ben went to the door. How about that slingshot? I haven't had time. It would be good if somebody looked before the trash gets picked up, Ben said. Maybe after I get off duty, the deputy said, letting Don out and locking the door again. Ben sat down and put the tray on his knees. He wasn't hungry, but eating was something to do. He had seen that slingshot between the Jeep's front seats. He unfolded the paper napkin. Written on the inside of it in pencil was, Can't find the slingshot, looked every place. Don. What had Maddox done with it? He'd only had a few seconds to hide it. Ben was still eating, not enjoying the food, when Strick came and opened the door. I've got to find that slingshot, Strick. Strick stood at the door waiting, his hand on the butt of his pistol. You walk in front of me, he said menacingly. I'm not some sort of thug, Ben said. Just walk in front of me. In the office, they were all there again, Houndruck, Sergeant Hamilton, his uncle, Sonia with her machine, Les Stanton and Denny O'Neill, and the two lawyers. Maddox was not there. Where's Maddox? Ben demanded. Nobody answered him, and Strick said, Sit down. Okay, Strick, Houndruck said. What'd you find out there? All the evidence checks with Mr. Maddox's story, Strick said, going over to Houndruck and handling him with two smashed but recognizable full patch bullets. We'll send these into ballistics, but I'm pretty sure they're slugs from a hornet. I found them on the ridge where Mr. Maddox says Ben killed the old man. There's plenty of traces of blood all over. Looked like somebody had a fight up there. No other slugs? Houndruck asked. Ben claims the man was killed with a .358. I already told you, Ben said. Maddox found that one and put it in his pocket. Strick looked over at him and said, That's what you did tell us, isn't it? Then he held out his hand with a .358 slug lying in it. I found this right near the other two. It's a .358. Ben hardly heard Houndruck say, Was this open ground, Strick? I mean, could Les and Denny have seen the body from the chopper? I'm coming to that, Strick said. There is distinct evidence that the body of that old man had been picked up and shoved in under a little overhang of rock so it couldn't be seen, not from a chopper. That's where Maddox put it, Ben said. They all seemed to ignore him. It was as tough he hadn't said anything. Next, Strick said, We found the old man's camp. It was a wreck. Somebody had just kicked it all to pieces. His blanket was all ripped up, his clothes ripped up, water can busted, oven busted, just a mess. But, he paused and looked over at Ben. There was no little tin box anywhere. Ben looked over at Houndruck. Am I allowed to ask anything? Sure, go ahead. Ben turned to Strick. You say there was a blanket at the camp. Any shoes? An old pair of boots, real beat up though. If they'd been there when I was there, why didn't I take them? Ben asked. I was naked. I could have used a blanket. I could have used any kind of boots. The lawyer Barowitz said pleasantly, "Doesn't it seem to you, Your Honor, that this young man is contradicting himself? If, as he claims, he was naked and shoeless, as he claims, he certainly would have taken those boots, no matter what condition. And as thus said, he could have used pieces of the blanket. The fact that he left all that stuff there seems to argue that he was not, shall we say, as naked as he claims he was." Ben felt as though he were talking inside a box or something, that nothing he said was being heard, nothing was being understood. "That's what I just said," Ben yelled at them. "Maddox went back later and put all that stuff there. For heaven's sakes, man, why?" Barowitz asked, "For what purpose would Mr. Maddox maneuver all that junk around?" "When I went to the camp there was nothing there," Ben said stubbornly, "including, I suppose, that mysterious little box containing that mysterious vanishing slingshot," Barowitz said. Okay, Hondrak said. "Let's don't get into any arguments, fellas. This is just an investigation. What about the butte, Strick?" "I'm not arguing," Ben said. We'll come back to that in a minute, Ben." Hondrak said. "All I want is to get the bare bones laid out, and then we can see what we've got. So about the butte, Strick." "Nobody climbed that butte," Strick said in a loud, positive voice Ben remembered from high school. "Somebody tried driving tent pegs in the wall and cutting some footholds, but nobody climbed it." "I climbed it," Ben said. Strick looked over at him. "Not up those tent pegs, you didn't. They don't go high enough. I climbed the other side." Strick smiled at him. "First you say you were running around there naked, and now you say you climbed that butte barehanded and buck naked. Well, I tell you, nobody without my mountain climbing gear could get up there. Isn't that right, Les?" "I couldn't," Les Stanton said. "I did," Ben said. All right, Hondrak said. "Now, Ben says he walked from the mountains over to the butte. Did you see any tracks of that, Strick?" "Les says he thinks there are some tracks, but they sure don't look like tracks to me." "Les," Hondrak asked. "There are tracks," Les said. "I can't swear to what made them. They're very indistinct, but if Ben was wearing sodal sandals the way he says, he might have made tracks like those." Les is an expert," Strick said, "but those things didn't look like man tracks to me, sandals or no sandals." Ben watched Les, but he only shrugged his shoulders. "Now at the campsite," Hondrak said. "They'd been there 2 or 3 days," Strick said, "so it was pretty messed up. You couldn't tell nothing from nothing. No slugs from Hornet. Nobody shot the Hornet," Ben said. If there if there are any there, it'll take a while to find them," Strick said. "We can go back when we've got more time." "Well," Hondrak said, "it looks to me like we've got evidence that the old man was shot twice by a Hornet rifle up on the ridge and that Mr. Maddox was shot by a Hornet rifle down on the desert." He looked over at the two lawyers sitting together on a bench. "So it looks to me like we're going to have to prefer some charges here. For the old man, suspicion of murder, and for Mr. Maddox, felony aggravated assault." Ben jumped up. "Wait a minute. You're not even listening. You're not even asking anybody anything. Ben, his uncle said to him. "Remember what I told you. Now hush up, Ben." Ben ignored him, walked over to where Les Stanton was sitting in a chair, his long legs stretched out in front of him. He drew them in as Ben came closer. "Les, did you go up on that butte?" "Yeah, we landed on top of it." "Did you see that tunnel about 50 feet down from the top, an old water tunnel with a catch basin in it?" Les didn't answer for a long time and didn't look up at Ben as he finally said, "Don't you remember, Ben, the day you and I flew over that butte, I showed you that catch basin in the tunnel?" "Les," Ben said. "That's why I went there. That's why I had to get up there, for the water." Mr. Barrowitz smiled and shook his head. "Now that explains a great many things," he said. "For example, it explains how you could describe that area very accurately without ever having been in that tunnel." "I was in it," Ben said. Les kept looking down at the floor. "You couldn't have reached that water using those tent pegs, Ben. You couldn't have done it." "I didn't. I came the other way." Les still didn't look up at Ben. I'm not calling you a liar, but a man couldn't get into that tunnel from the other side. There was no use trying to convince them. Ben decided he had to prove to them. Did you go down into the tunnel? He asked. I roped down to it. For years, Ben had thought of Les as one of the best and most honest of men, and the most desert smart man he'd ever known. People liked to say Les could track a bat. While I was in that tunnel, Ben said, making his voice stay level and quiet, I shot 11 birds with that slingshot, and I ate them, and I left the bones. Did you see any bones, Les? Les didn't say anything, just sat there frowning. Ben couldn't believe it. Les wouldn't miss anything as obvious as those bones. Gamble's quail, Ben said. At last, Les looked up. There might have been bones. I just didn't see any, Ben. It was getting pretty dark in there. Ben stared at him. Then a whiptail lizard. I shot and ate one of those too, except the skin. I didn't see it, Ben, Les said. Let's go back up there, will you? First thing in the morning. Berowitz said calmly, Your Honor, I suggest that since this is not a trial but simply a hearing, we can avoid confusion by not dealing with minor details. Ben whirled on him. They are not minor details. If there are bones up there in that tunnel, it proves I was there, not where Maddox says I was. He turned back to Les. We've got to get them, Les, before something else does. Ben, Houndreck said firmly, I'll handle this, if you please. But don't you see, sir, if there are bones, may I interject something here? Berowitz said. Don't birds sometimes die a natural death, Your Honor? As Ben started to yell at him, the sheriff held up his hand but kept on reading from a book in his lap. Now here's what Mr. Maddox said, that during the first couple of days you two were in the desert. You, Ben, were fooling around that butte. He says he doesn't know whether you climbed it or not because he was off hunting bighorn, but you tried to climb it. Fooling around, Ben shouted and then lowered his voice. If I was just fooling around him, would I have eaten raw birds and a raw lizard? Berowitz said, looking at Houndrug. Although I agree with Your Honor that these details should be left to the court, I would like to suggest that a mere presence of some bird bones does not in any way identify the person who ate the meat from them. In fact, I bow to you, men's far wider experience in the desert than I think you will all agree that the mere presence of bones doesn't even establish how they got there, or how the bird died, or what happened to the carcasses. Yeah, Humdrek said. Sit down, Ben. You know I'm real sorry about this, but you can see how things look, and I'm just the justice of the peace, Ben. And this isn't a court. This isn't final. All I'm doing is establishing whether there's enough evidence to hold somebody. You see? There's plenty, Ben said, but not to hold me. Now sit down, Ben, Houndrek said sternly. Ben sat down slowly, looked from man to man. The two lawyers were busy gathering up their briefcases and straightening their ties. Les sat frowning down at the floor. Sergeant Hamilton had moved over and was talking quietly to Strick. Houndrek sat at the desk writing something. No one was looking at him, not even Denny O'Neill, who was looking at his watch, or Sonia, who was gathering up the narrow folds of paper. If those people who were once my friends will not believe me, will not even listen to me, Ben thought, what chance have I got when they take me out of this town and we go to a court at the county seat where nobody knows me? Madoc was so good. Everything was tied together neatly and logically with evidence to prove it. And then Ben remembered. His voice sounded high and excited as he said, Mr. Houndrek, let me ask Les one more thing. Now, Ben, just one thing. Okay, make it short. Les, Ben said, when you came down in the chopper, where did Maddox say I was? In the mountains. He said you had been shooting bighorn and he was pretty sore about it. How far away was from the chopper? Les looked over at Denny. 7, 8 miles? About 7, Denny said. So I couldn't have seen you. What's the point of all this? Berowitz asked. You wait, Ben snapped at him. Les, could I have seen you? Well, you could have seen the chopper. No, I mean you. What you had on, what you were wearing. Well, I don't know, Ben. No, I guess not. Not from 7 miles.